April 1864. A man sits alone in a small farmhouse office in Virginia. A half-finished letter lies in front of him. His hands are steady, but his uniform still smells of gunpowder from 3 days ago. Outside, thousands of soldiers are waiting for a single order, an order only he can give. What if this man, the one about to command over 1 million soldiers, had failed at nearly everything he ever tried? What if the general who would end the Civil War had once failed at farming, failed at business, and couldn't even sell firewood without people laughing at him? This is not a story about talent. This is a story about a man nobody believed in, until the day he became the only man who could win the war. His name was Ulysses S. Grant. Today, people remember him as the general who saved the Union, and later, as President of the United States. But almost nobody remembers how close he came to disappearing into history as just another failed man. By the time he was 39 years old, Grant had failed at farming, he had failed at real estate, he had failed at business. He was working behind a counter in his father's leather shop, taking orders from his own younger brothers. By the end of this story, you will understand how a man everyone had counted out became the one person strong enough to hold a broken nation together, and you'll understand what it truly cost him to do it. Ulysses Grant was born on April 27, 1822, in a tiny village called Point Pleasant, Ohio. His father ran a tannery, a business that turned animal hides into leather. Most boys in his position would have learned the family trade. But young Ulysses hated it. The blood and the smell made him sick. He avoided the tannery whenever he could. There was only one place he felt at home: on a horse. Even as a small boy, he could calm a wild animal that grown men couldn't control. It was the one thing he was quietly, undeniably good at. His father had other plans. Without asking his son, he arranged for Ulysses to attend West Point, the country's military academy. Grant didn't want to go. He didn't want to be a soldier at all, but he went anyway, because his father told him to. At West Point, Grant was an average student. He wasn't a natural leader. He wasn't the top of his class. The only subject he truly excelled in was horsemanship. Everything else, he simply endured. But when the Mexican-American War broke out, something in him changed. On the battlefield, Grant was calm where others panicked. He rode through open fire to deliver messages. Officers began to notice him. For the first time in his life, he was good at something the world actually valued. During this time, he married a woman named Julia Dent. She would become the single steadiest presence in his entire life. Whatever else the world took from him, Julia never once stopped believing in him. After the war, the army sent Grant to a lonely outpost, far from his family. Weeks turned into months without seeing Julia or his children. The isolation ate at him. Some fellow officers later claimed he began drinking heavily to cope with the loneliness. In 1854, under pressure and quiet accusations, Grant resigned from the army. He was 32 years old, with no career, no income, and a family to support. He had walked away from the one thing he had ever been good at. He thought leaving the army was the end of his hardest chapter. He had no idea it was only the beginning. He tried farming on land near St. Louis. He named it, half-jokingly, hardscrabble. The joke turned out to be true. The soil was poor, the work was brutal, and the farm failed within a few years. Desperate for money, Grant sold firewood on street corners in the city. Men he had once outranked in the army walked past him without recognition. Some who did recognize him only laughed. Eventually, with nowhere else to turn, Grant went to work as a clerk in his father's leather store in Galena, Illinois. He was 38 years old. taking daily orders from his own younger brothers. By almost every measure that mattered to the world around him, Ulysses S. Grant was a failure. Then, in April of 1861, the Civil War began. The Union suddenly needed every trained officer it could find. Grant, the failed farmer, the failed businessman, the man behind the store counter, put his old uniform back on. He was given command of a volunteer regiment. It wasn't much, but for the first time in 7 years, Grant had a purpose again. His first major victory came at Fort Donelson. When the Confederate commander asked for terms of surrender, Grant gave a now famous answer: unconditional surrender. The North needed a hero, and suddenly, it had found one. But victory came at a terrible price. At the Battle of Shiloh, thousands of soldiers on both sides were killed in just 2 days. It was more American deaths than in every previous American war combined. The public was horrified, and they blamed Grant. Old rumors of his drinking resurfaced. Politicians pushed President Lincoln to remove him from command. For a moment, it looked like Grant's second chance was already slipping away. Lincoln had a choice to make, and that choice would decide the fate of the entire war. Lincoln refused to remove him. He said simply, "I can't spare this man. He fights." It was one of the most important decisions of the entire war. Grant went on to lead the long, grinding siege of Vicksburg, cutting off the Confederacy's control of the Mississippi River. It took weeks of exhausting, patient pressure. But when the city finally fell, the Union had split the South in two. By 1864, Grant was placed in command of the entire Union Army. He launched a new campaign against General Robert E. Lee. At the Battle of the Wilderness, and later at Cold Harbor, Union casualties were staggering. Newspapers began calling him the Butcher. After the brutal fighting in the Wilderness, every previous Union general had done the same thing. They pulled back and retreated. Grant's own officers expected him to do the same. He didn't. Instead, Grant ordered his army to keep moving south, deeper toward Lee's forces. It was the first time in the entire war that a Union army pressed forward after such heavy losses. The soldiers understood immediately what it meant. This commander was not going to stop. Not after Shiloh, not after Wilderness, not after any cost. He would keep pressing forward until the war was won. For nearly 10 months, Grant laid siege to the city of Petersburg, slowly cutting off Lee's supplies and options. It was not glamorous. It was not fast. It was simply relentless, patient pressure, month after month. And slowly, without one single dramatic battle, Grant was closing every door Robert E. Lee had left. By the spring of 1865, Lee's army was starving, exhausted, and nearly surrounded. There was nowhere left to retreat to. On April 9, 1865, Robert E. Lee rode to a small farmhouse in Appomattox Courthouse, Virginia, to meet Ulysses S. Grant. 4 years of war had come down to this one quiet room. Grant could have demanded punishment. He could have demanded prisoners, trials, humiliation. That was what many in the North wanted. Instead, Grant offered generous terms. Confederate soldiers could go home. Officers could keep their sidearms. Any man who owned a horse could keep it, to help plow the fields when they returned home. Lee signed the surrender. The war, the one that had taken over 600,000 American lives, was finally over. Word spread through the camps almost instantly. There was no wild celebration. Grant himself later wrote that he felt no joy, only relief, and a deep sadness for what the war had cost everyone, on both sides. The man who once sold firewood on a street corner, the man nobody believed in, had just ended the deadliest war in American history. In 1869, Grant became President of the United States. He worked to protect the rights of newly freed Black Americans, pushing back against violent groups like the Ku Klux Klan during a fragile and difficult time in the country's history. Years after leaving office, Grant placed his trust and nearly all of his family's savings into an investment firm run by a young partner named Ferdinand Ward. Ward was a fraud. In 1884, the firm collapsed overnight. Grant lost almost everything he owned. The man who had once commanded 1,000,000 soldiers was, once again, nearly penniless. As if that weren't enough, Grant was soon diagnosed with throat cancer. The disease was aggressive. Doctors gave him only months to live. He had lost his fortune. He was losing his health. But there was one more thing he refused to lose. With almost no money left for his family, Grant made a final decision. He would write his memoirs and race against the disease to finish them, so his wife and children would have something to live on after he was gone. For months, in constant pain, barely able to speak, Grant wrote almost every single day. His friend, the writer Mark Twain, agreed to publish the finished book. Grant finished the final pages of his memoirs just days before he died, on July 23, 1885. The book became one of the best-selling memoirs in American history, and it secured his family's future exactly as he had hoped. So what can we take from the life of Ulysses S. Grant? The first lesson is this: failure is not the end of your story. Grant failed at farming, at business, and nearly at life itself, more than once. And still, he became the man who saved a nation. The second lesson is about quiet persistence. Grant was never the smartest man in the room. He simply refused to stop moving forward, one step at a time, even when the cost was enormous. And the third lesson is this: real strength is not what you do when everyone is watching. It's what you do at the very end, when no one would blame you for giving up. Grant gave everything he had left, until his very last page. If Ulysses Grant's story moved you, hit subscribe, so we can bring you more true stories like his, right here on Life Graphy.